I never expected a quiet afternoon in the garden to turn into a moment that changed how I saw myself and how I understood the weight of being someone others turn to when they're lost. What started as a simple conversation became a lesson about listening, patience, and the unexpected ways we guide one another. Before we begin, tell me something in the comments. Which city are you watching from today? I love knowing where these stories travel. And if stories like this speak to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. It helps more than you know, and it keeps these quiet, reflective moments coming. Now, let me tell you what happened. I was in my garden that afternoon, the kind of afternoon that feels borrowed from a gentler time. The sun sat low but warm, not demanding anything, just resting on the leaves and soil like it belonged there. I'm in my early 50s now, and gardening has become more than a hobby. It's where I go to think, to remember, and sometimes to forget. The roses along the fence were just starting to open, and the tomato plants leaned heavily against their stakes, full of promise. That's when I heard the gate. It wasn't loud, just the soft click of metal and the hesitant creak of wood. I turned, wiping my hands on the towel tucked into my waistband, and saw him standing there, my friend's nephew. I'd met him only twice before, always in passing, always polite. He was grown, well into adulthood, but there was something in his posture that day that made him look younger somehow, like he wasn't sure where to place his feet. "Hi," he said, clearing his throat. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," I replied, surprised but calm. "You're just in time to see me argue with a stubborn weed." That earned a small smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He stepped into the garden slowly, as if entering a space that required permission beyond the open gate. I noticed how his gaze wandered, taking in the neat rows, the old stone bench under the oak tree, the wind chimes barely moving. "I didn't know where else to go," he said after a moment. "Your sister said you might be out here." I nodded, gesturing toward the bench. "Sit. You look like you've been carrying something heavy." He hesitated, then sat, resting his elbows on his knees. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just full. I've learned over the years that silence can be an invitation if you let it be. "I feel like I'm standing at a crossroads," he finally said, "and every sign is pointing in a different direction." I leaned against the fence, listening, not planning a response, not trying to fix anything, just listening. Men his age don't often expect that from a woman my age. They expect advice, or judgment, or a quick solution. What he needed, I could tell, was space to hear himself think. He talked about work that didn't feel right anymore, about expectations that weren't his own, about waking up each morning with a sense that time was moving faster than he was. His words came carefully, like he was afraid of saying the wrong thing, even though there was no wrong thing to say here. As he spoke, I saw pieces of my younger self in him. The uncertainty, the quiet fear of choosing wrong and living with it. I remembered how often I'd wished for someone older to simply tell me that it was normal to feel lost, that being unsure didn't mean I was failing. "You know," I said gently when he paused, "gardens don't grow because we force them to. They grow because we pay attention. We notice what needs light, what needs water, and what needs time." He looked up at me then, really looked at me, as if he hadn't expected an answer like that. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of earth and leaves between us. In that moment, I felt the quiet responsibility of being seen as someone steady, someone safe. We sat there for a long while, the sun inching lower, shadows stretching across the garden beds. I didn't realize it then, but that conversation was only the beginning. Something had been set in motion, not dramatic or loud, but meaningful all the same. And as I returned to my plants later that evening, I felt a subtle shift inside myself too, a reminder that guidance doesn't always come from having the answers, but from being willing to stand with someone while they search. The next time he came by, it wasn't by accident. I knew it the moment I saw him walking up the gravel path, this time without hesitation. He didn't pause at the gate. He didn't look around like he was trespassing. He simply opened it and stepped into the garden as if he remembered exactly how the ground felt beneath his shoes. I was trimming the lavender, the scent already thick in the warm air. Late afternoon again. Funny how moments seem to choose similar light when they want to continue a conversation. I thought I might find you here, he said. You usually will, I answered, smiling without thinking much about it. He stood beside me for a moment, watching my hands work. There's something calming about being observed without being evaluated. I could sense that he wasn't here to unload everything at once. This time felt different, more settled, or maybe more ready. I've been thinking about what you said, he told me, about paying attention. I nodded. And what did you notice? He exhaled slowly. That I've been rushing past things that matter, and standing still in places that don't. We walked together along the rows. I showed him how the cucumbers were starting to climb, how I tied the vines loosely so they could choose their own path upward. He listened closely, asking simple questions, the kind that come from genuine curiosity rather than politeness. At the bench, he sat again, but this time he leaned back, looking up through the branches of the oak tree. The leaves whispered overhead, and the wind chimes caught a bit more breeze than before, their sound soft and thoughtful. My uncle thinks I should just push through, he said, that everyone feels this way, and you just work harder until it goes away. And do you believe that? I asked. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I wondered if I'd asked too directly. But then he said, No, I think ignoring it is what got me here. I sat across from him, folding my hands in my lap. I felt the familiar pull of wanting to protect, to guide without overstepping. There's a delicate balance when you're older, when people start mistaking your calm for certainty. When I was your age, I thought clarity would arrive all at once, like a door swinging open, but it doesn't work that way. It comes in pieces, conversations, small choices. He looked at me with an expression that was part relief, part recognition, as if I'd given shape to something he'd been carrying without a name. The light shifted again, catching the dust in the air. I noticed how comfortable the silence had become between us. Not heavy, not awkward, shared. I don't want to disappoint anyone, he said quietly. That's an honest fear, I replied. But you're allowed to disappoint people if it means being honest with yourself. Respect doesn't come from living someone else's life. He absorbed that, nodding slowly. I could almost see the tension easing from his shoulders, not disappearing, but loosening its grip. Before he left, he thanked me. Not in a dramatic way, just a simple, grounded thank you. The kind that means more than a dozen compliments. After he was gone, I stayed on the bench longer than usual. I thought about how easy it is to underestimate the impact of presence. I hadn't planned to become a point of reference in his life, but maybe that's how these things happen. Quietly, naturally. As dusk settled, I realized something else too. Guiding him wasn't just helping him find direction. It was reminding me that my own experiences, the years I sometimes dismiss as ordinary, still have weight, still have purpose. And that realization stayed with me long after the garden went dark. By the third visit, I had stopped counting them as visits at all. He arrived one morning instead of the afternoon, catching me by surprise. The sun was higher, sharper, and the garden looked different in that light. Less forgiving, more honest. I was kneeling near the herb bed, my knees protesting as they always did now, when his shadow crossed the soil. I hope this isn't too early, he said. I stood slowly, brushing dirt from my palms. Nothing good in a garden waits for perfect timing, I told him. You're fine. He laughed at that, a real laugh this time, and it struck me how much lighter he sounded than when we first spoke. Not fixed, not resolved, but more present. We worked side by side for a while without talking. I handed him a small trowel and showed him how to loosen the soil without disturbing the roots. He followed my lead carefully, respectful of the space, of the process. There was something grounding about doing simple work together. No advice, no confessions, just shared effort. After a while, he wiped his forehead and sat back on his heels. "I made a decision," he said. I didn't respond right away. I've learned not to rush moments like that. They deserve room. "I asked for a leave," he continued. "Not forever. Just time. To think without everything buzzing in my ear." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a quiet pride that surprised me. "That takes courage," I said, "more than pretending nothing's wrong." He nodded. "I don't know where it leads, but it feels like I finally chose something instead of being dragged." We sat on the grass then, backs against the low stone wall. The day warmed around us. Bees moved lazily between the flowers. Life continuing at its own steady pace, indifferent to our human urgency. "I keep thinking about paths," he said. "How you said vines choose their way up." "They do," I replied, "but only because someone gave them something to climb." He turned that over in his mind. I could tell. He always did. Thoughtful that way. There was a moment then, subtle but important, when I felt the shift. Not toward dependence, but toward balance. He wasn't here because he was lost anymore. He was here because he wanted to understand himself better, and he trusted me to witness that process. That trust is not something I take lightly. He asked me about my life then, not in a casual way, but with genuine interest. So I told him some things, about choices I'd made, about the ones I hadn't, about how I learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that self-respect is built from small, repeated acts of honesty. I didn't dress it up. I didn't turn myself into a lesson. I just told the truth. The afternoon wore on, and eventually he stood, brushing grass from his jeans. "I don't want to take too much," he said. "You're not taking," I replied. "You're participating." He smiled at that, a calm, steady smile. "I'm glad I came through the gate that first day." "So am I," said, surprised by how much I meant it. After he left, I walked the garden slowly, noticing things I usually overlooked. A cracked pot that still held a healthy plant. A patch of soil richer for having been turned twice. Evidence that attention, even imperfect attention, makes a difference. I realized then that this chapter of my life wasn't about winding down. It was about opening up in a quieter way. About being useful not through effort, but through presence. And that felt like a kind of growth I hadn't expected, but deeply welcomed. That evening, the garden felt different. Not because anything had changed, everything was just as it had always been, but because I was seeing it through a lens I hadn't known I needed. The roses were fully open now, petals soft and heavy with fragrance, and the last light of the day painted the leaves gold. I could hear the distant hum of traffic from the road, birds settling in the trees, and the faint whistle of the wind through the chimes. It was ordinary, and yet it carried a sense of completeness I couldn't have described before. He came again as the sun was lowering, the way it does in late fall, long shadows stretching across the garden paths. This time there was no hesitation in his step, no glance to check if he was intruding. He simply came, and I could see that the weight he had carried when I first met him had shifted. Not vanished, of course. Life doesn't work that way, but softened, easier to manage, easier to acknowledge. "Hello," he said, voice calm. "I've been looking forward to today." "Me too," I said, and meant it. We began slowly, moving from the garden beds to the stone bench beneath the oak tree. He sat down first, letting out a long breath as if the air itself could carry away the tension. I joined him, settling into the familiar space, noticing how the late sunlight caught his hair and made it look almost copper. There was no need to rush. The garden, it seemed, had taught us patience, and that patience extended to our conversation. I took some time off work, he said after a while, letting the words roll out gently. I spent a few days just walking, thinking, listening to things other than my own restlessness. I nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction. And I asked, curious but careful. I think I finally understand, he said. Not everything, not even most things, but enough to stop panicking at every choice. Enough to feel steady and like I can keep going. It struck me then how far we had come together. That the first hesitant visit, the careful questions, the shared silences, had led to this moment of clarity, not for me, necessarily, but for him. And in that clarity, I recognized my own reflection. How much I had grown just by being present, by listening without judgment, by sharing small pieces of experience instead of giving grand answers. We spoke more after that about small things, how the sun changes the color of the tomato leaves, the rhythm of birdsong in the early morning, the way the garden smells different when rain is coming. And in that simplicity, there was depth, connection, mutual understanding. He wasn't my responsibility, not fully, but I had become a companion in his journey, and he had become a mirror of sorts for my own. As twilight approached, he stood and stretched. "Thank you," he said, "not just for today, for the past few weeks, for being here." "You were already doing the work," I told him. "I just happened to be here while you figured it out." He smiled then, a full, quiet smile that carried warmth without words. And as he left through the gate, I stayed behind a little longer, breathing in the cool evening air, listening to the garden settle around me. The roses had closed their petals, the shadows had grown long, and the wind chimes sang a gentle farewell. Sitting there, I realized that what had started as an unexpected visit had turned into something far richer than advice or guidance. It had become a shared space where trust, patience, and attention created growth on both sides. And just as the garden would bloom again in the spring, I understood that life, ours and theirs, could be nurtured quietly, steadily, with care and respect. I stood, brushing soil from my hands, and looked around. The garden was ordinary, but it held everything extraordinary about that time. I felt gratitude for his courage, for the lessons learned in silence, and for the reminder that sometimes the simplest connections carry the deepest meaning. And with that, I walked inside, carrying a sense of quiet accomplishment that no one could see, but that I would remember always.